this in a way that would ensure optimum synergies between the original, but the idea of course, technology.
Someone tutoring me as to how to deal with.
Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Interpreting Table Talk. We have a very special guest with us today, and I'm excited that we've finally been able to find the time to have her over from basically just down the hallway. But make no mistake, she has so many things going on that this does not go without saying. She is a practicing interpreter, a conference interpreter. She is an assistant professor here at the FTI's Interpreting Department, and she joined us in 2015. She is also the coordinator of the Access Research Group, and what they do is they focus on the development of interpreter training programs for interpreters working in different stages along the evolution of conflicts. They do so, however, based on research data. She is also a colleague here at the department, as I said, and I really appreciate, Lucia, that you made the time to be here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lucia Ruiz Rosendo.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you. Thank you.
Lucia, we are here to talk about your research interests. First and foremost, we're also here to talk about a special volume that you published and you co-edited together with a colleague, Clementina Perso, back in 2016. It is called Interpreters in Conflict Situations and in Conflict Zones Throughout History. Perhaps you can start by telling us how you became interested in this particular area of interpreting.
So thank you very much again, Killian. Thank you. That is a very good question. As a matter of fact, I have always been interested in history. I love history. I think it allows us to understand where we stand right now. So then interpreting is my profession. From the very beginning, I have been interested in the history of interpreting in general. And then I started to read articles on the history of interpreting, and I realized that there is a link between a conflict and between conflicts and the evolution of a profession. You can see how major advances in our profession have taken place after a major conflict. I am thinking of the First World War, the Second World War, but also some conflicts in antiquity, for example, the Napoleonic Wars, etc.
That's true, because very recently we had Jesus Baigorri on this program, and he told us about his recent book in which some of these developments are actually described after World War I and, well, First World War and World War II, with both conference interpreting and then simultaneous interpreting really, well, taking a huge leap forward. Now, today the news are full of stories about interpreters working in conflict zones. I'm going to use conflict zones for the time being. I do realize there's a terminological issue, and perhaps we'll talk about that a little later. But it seems that it's become somewhat of a hot topic. So why this special volume on interpreters in conflict zones, but throughout history? What does history add to this? What's the added value of looking at this particular topic through the lens of history?
So we thought that, and I think it's precisely because of that, interpreting in conflict zones is a hot topic today. So we thought that it was interesting to have in one volume, to offer to the reader in one volume, an analysis of the different events that have shaped the profession, but not events in general. I mean, conflicts in particular. So I think it is important, first of all, to analyze the role of the members of any profession, to understand how the profession has evolved throughout time and space as well. So we focus on interpreters, but interpreters who work in conflict zones in order to understand better what is happening right now, in order to understand all the concepts that you can read in the different articles or in press articles, scholarly articles as well. Concepts such as the protection of the interpreter, the training schemes offered for interpreters, ethical implications, psychological implications, because this is not new. I mean, this has been a commonality of all the different periods in history, you know, when we talk about the role of interpreters in a conflict zone. So we wanted to analyze all these concepts throughout history to better understand the concepts right now. It is important to analyze, it is important to see how all these challenges have existed for a long time. They are not new, and how the challenges have been resolved in the past. It will allow us as well to predict new difficulties and to avoid them as well. So in conclusion, this volume was conceived as a very important one in order to understand better the present and the future.
Mm-hmm. Now, you did so with whom exactly as a reader in mind? Were you thinking of a particular readership as you were selecting the different submissions to the volume? Particularly also seeing that many of the contributions come from non-interpreters. Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is an interdisciplinary topic. So here, if we want to analyze the role of interpreters in a conflict zone, we need to read publications coming from other fields. We need to learn from other scholars who publish in other fields. And I'm thinking of course, translation studies, but also sociology, peace and conflict studies, international relations, cultural studies, to name but a few. So we thought it was really important to have a representation of all these fields in this volume, because how can we understand the role of interpreters in conflict zones throughout history without contributions coming from people who analyze this topic from another perspective? For example, there is one author who is a military, who works for the military, and we have also contributions from scholars coming from cultural studies and also history. So I think we need more interdisciplinary volumes covering all these fields that should be analyzing the role of interpreters in conflict zones.
Coming back to the field itself and seeing that you just use the term conflict zone yourself, there is this terminological issue that you also partly address in the volume. There seems to be little consensus on what to call this field, the field of research or even the field of practice. And in doing a little research myself, I've tried to read up and preparing for our interview. I've come across humanitarian interpreting, I've come across conflict zone interpreting, I've come across conflict scenario interpreting, field interpreting. So my question to you, and there are a few more, my question to you is, are we still grappling with the definition of the concept or even the object of study? Or have you been able to find genuine differences between the different terms as applied to the concept?
I think that we should be more specific when we talk about interpreting in conflict zones. So a conflict zone is it is a place where a conflict is taking place. For example, Afghanistan, for example, Iraq. Then we have conflict-related scenarios because a conflict has consequences. And for example, my country, Spain, is not a conflict zone, but we have conflict-related scenarios. For example, the refugee crisis. Refugees coming to Spain, and interpreters are needed there as well. But Spain is not the conflict zone. So I think it is important to make the distinction between the conflict zone and conflict-related situations, scenarios, etc. And these conflict-related scenarios might take place in the conflict zone, but also in other places as well. So these are consequences of the conflict. I think it is also important to take into account the organization or the institution for which the interpreter is working. And I'm thinking, for example, you mentioned humanitarian interpreting. These interpreters work for organizations with a humanitarian mandate. For example, the ICRC, the UNHCR, etc. And we have to make the distinction between humanitarian interpreters and interpreters who work for the military, for example, because the tasks are different, the concepts apply differently as well.
So a multifaceted constellation of
yes.
Sometimes the conflict zone being the same, but the interpreters working for different parties
exactly.
and therefore carrying out different tasks and taking on a different role, since it is a role that you
exactly.
describe in your book.
There are some commonalities between the different interpreters, but there are also some differences. And I think we should be even more specific, because when we are talking about interpreters who work for the military, we have to take into account the kind of operations that are performed, that are, organized by the military. Because the role of the interpreter is different. For example, if the interpreter is working in the context of a counterinsurgency operation, the role is going to be different to other contexts. So I think, yes, we have general concepts right now. Now you can see in different publications new definitions, for example, humanitarian interpreting in this publication by Delgado and Kerbish. But we have to go a step further and be even more specific and take into account the type, the specificities of the context.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very interesting. You should say that, seeing that there is also this general debate on the definition of conference interpreting, for example. I don't know if you've been following that, and there is definitely one push towards a more general definition of what an interpreter is rather than a more specific one. So I find it interesting that in this particular area, specificity might well make the difference. Now, in the volume, to come back to it, there are a number of different chapters, obviously contributed by different people, but also relating to different periods of time and different places, different events. We have a description of the role of the interpreter in the 16th and 17th century in Spain by de Moura and colleagues. Again, 17th century, the Sino-Dutch War with Chang, but then coming up all the way to World War I with Cowley, and World War II with Kuyameki. So this means there are contributions that span a good several hundred years. Have you, as editors, so you and Clementina, have you been able to identify similarities between the role of the interpreters in different places and different events and across history? And what are the main differences that you've been able to flag, if any?
Yes, many similarities, because, and that was quite fascinating, because we could see how these interpreters were not interpreters as such. I mean, interpreting was not a profession. In the case of the Moura's article, for example, they were there to indoctrinate, to evangelize the indigenous, but they were interpreters. And in the case of Cowley's contribution or Kuyamaki's contribution that you just mentioned, they weren't interpreters. They were just there. They spoke 2 or more languages, and they started to act as interpreters. But their profession was not interpreting. So that is one of the similarities. And another similarity is their complex positionality, because these interpreters are judge and jury in the conflict. I mean, they belong to one of the communities in the conflict, usually, and you can see that, in the different chapters. So this is another commonality, and that leads to many implications, ethical implications. For example, the neutrality, the impact of the personality, of emotions on their decisions, etc. This is another one. So I would say that another similarity is the lack of definition of the tasks they perform. So they interpreted, yes, that's that's true, but they translated as well. They evangelized the indigenous. So depending on the conflict, they performed different tasks, not only interpreting. And then differences, yes, fewer differences than similarities, I would say. One of the differences is, yes, it's related to the characteristics of the context. For example, the context described by D'Amore and colleagues' article is quite different, no? So it was the indoctrination of indigenous. So, I mean, here we can see the differences because it was a religious conflict, no, here as well. So I think, yeah, the main difference maybe is that we can see an evolution in the recognition of the interpreter. If we compare, for example, the military events of the 17th or 18th century to the Second World War, I think there was a better recognition of the interpreter, no? When we read the 4 chapters that deal with the Second World War. But I mean, not that many differences. Mm-hmm.
Now, you talked about an evolution in order to assess this evolution. Obviously, you need snapshots along the timeline. And inevitably, when you do historical research, you will come across periods of time where you have less data and you encounter black holes, perhaps, where you don't really have anything informing your guesses. In looking at the different contributions to your volume, were there such black holes? Are there such blind spots in the evolution of the role of the interpreter? And conversely, are there periods of time where you had a lot of information?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there is, because when we were drafting the introduction and we realized that there are very, very few records on the Crusades, for example. It is a fascinating, well, fascinating from the point of view of the languages involved and the communication issues, etc. But there are very few records on the Crusades, for example. There are many records on, for example, the conquistadores, no, the conquest of the Americas. We have interpreters at this time were even called by name. We have very important interpreters, La Malinche, Doña Marina, Felipillo, Jerónimo de Aguilar, etc. And then, and it is also quite surprising that even in some contemporary conflicts, there are very few records. For example, the First World War compared to the Second World War. And here we have more records describing the role of the interpreters who worked for the dictators and all the politicians, who worked in Nazi concentration camps, in the battleground. So I would say these 2 major conflicts, the Crusades and the First World War, very different conflicts. But here, yes, there is a gap. No, we have very, very few records.
So, in trying to come to an end, what are the conclusions that you draw when it comes to the evolution of the interpreter's role? You said that there are more commonalities than there are differences in the interpreter's role throughout history, but now looking at the evolution, how has it changed? How has it changed, and to which extent does that knowledge, or can that knowledge, of the change of the role of the interpreter inform us when it comes to what's going on around us today?
Mm-hmm. A very interesting question, because I said before that it is important to read contributions from scholars from outside, no, translation studies. When you read articles from the field of peace and conflict studies, you realize that the concept, the notion of war, of conflict has changed. If you read Clausewitz, for example. But the role of the interpreter who works in a conflict has not changed that much. So I think this is quite, interesting. So I would say that yeah, the role of the interpreter has not changed that much. We witnessed, the professionalization of the profession of the interpreter from the second half of the 20th century, but only for conference interpreters. So here, and this is the main difference if we compare the different historical different periods in history, we can see how from the second half of the 20th century we started to see the professionalization of a part of the profession of interpreter, but other other categories of interpreter did not experience that professionalization, but they continue to exist. So we saw on the one hand conference interpreters, and on the other hand interpreters who work in public services but also in conflict-related scenarios. So we have seen that yes, there has been a change in the profession, of course, I mean that is obvious, but in a part of the profession. Regarding interpreters who work in a conflict, we have not seen this evolution. I mean, there are still many similarities. The lack of training, the lack of a definition of the profession, the role is elusive, and the status continues to be low. So we see all these differences, and we come to the conclusion that, I mean, the role of the interpreter who works in a conflict zone hasn't changed that much. So the main difference is that we have this contradiction. Yes, there has been a professionalization of the profession, but only of a part of it. That is why it is also important to have a volume devoted to interpreters in conflict zones, because this role is different to conference interpreting in terms of the big concepts related to interpreting, neutrality, partiality, training, etc. So I think the main difference, and this is going to be the future, is the technology. So in the past, in the Roman Empire, I mean, conflicts were different, and also the role of the interpreter because there was no technology as we know it nowadays. Now I think there is an investment on softwares to help the military personnel to communicate with the native speakers of a country. And I think now interpreters have more technological tools when performing their duties, their work. So I mean, this is the main difference, and I think there is going to be an evolution in the technologies that are going to be used in the field as well. At least for the military, yes. So I think it is important to analyze this main difference to see what will probably, may perhaps happen in the future.
Listen, this is great stuff, fascinating topic, and a wonderful contribution. I think we're coming to the end of our time slot today. I'd like to thank you for being here with us, Lucia Ruiz Rosendo. This is it for today's Table Talk. Thank you for having been with us. My name is Kenny Cedar, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon.